Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on permitting reform. This is part of the Woods Institute's ongoing series of policy-focused briefings that explore the intersection of environment, energy, and sustainability. Before addressing the main topic, I want to start with acknowledging the Indigenous people on whose ancestral land those of us at Stanford sit today. Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. For today's webinar on permitting reform, how best to combine accelerating the energy transition, protecting the environment, and ensuring fairness, I'm thrilled to be joined by Governor Phil Bredesen, Anna Unruh-Cohen, and Dan Riker. I'm Chris Field, director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. The Woods Institute has been, for nearly 20 years, Stanford's marquee investment in advancing understanding and developing practical, just solutions to our era's pressing environmental problems. Woods scholars team with other researchers, governments, companies, and NGOs to build bridges from research to action to address challenges in climate, health, food, water, oceans, and biodiversity. We're excited to be a founding pillar in the bold new Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, officially launched just over a year ago. Today's session is part of our continuing exploration of climate solutions. This is our last planned webinar for 2023, and we look forward to a full calendar in 2024. Please check the Woods website for information on upcoming events related to climate and sustainability. We all know that solving the climate crisis will require building stuff, a lot of stuff. Almost all the things we need to build, from seawalls to wind farms to electricity transmission lines, require permitting. For many projects, permitting creates large risks, expenses, and delays. Permitting in the US is famously complex, with many layers of analysis, reviews, and public input, with some of the projects involving many jurisdictions. For advocates for the environment and for environmental justice, the permitting process is a key point for ensuring that projects have appropriate protections, but that also makes it a key point for confrontation and lawsuits. We're in an era where almost everyone recognizes that the permitting process for climate solutions needs to work better, but the specifics of a better system are far from clear. Are there ways to streamline the permitting process while still protecting the environment and ensuring justice? How much of the change needs to be in the regulations, and how much can come from being smarter about building broad coalitions that can come to agreement on big picture goals and the trade-offs and compromises necessary to reach them? For a perspective on these questions, I'm excited to be joined by three distinguished experts. Philip Bredesen Jr. was the mayor of Nashville from 1991 to 1999, and the 48th governor of Tennessee from 2003 to 2011. He's the most recent Democrat elected to statewide office in Tennessee. Since 2011, he's been chair of Silicon Ranch Corporation, a firm that develops and operates solar power stations. Phil's also the founder of ClearLoop, a renewable energy startup designed to enable companies to take control of their greenhouse gas emissions. I had the privilege of working with Phil on the recently released report on forging climate solutions from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Phil is also the host, along with Bill Haslam, the 49th governor of Tennessee, of the podcast You Might Be Right. Anna Unruh-Cohen has spent the last 2 decades working on climate and energy policy in Washington, starting with a posting as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow with then Congressman Markey's staff. Since then, Anna has held senior positions with the Center for American Progress, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Senator Markey's staff, and 3 House committees, the Natural Resources Committee, the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming, and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. In the latter role, Anna facilitated the 2020 Congressional Climate Action Plan that set the stage for climate action through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Since May of this year, Anna has served as Senior Director for Clean Energy Infrastructure and the National Environmental Policy Act at the Environmental Protection Agency. Dan Riker is a senior research scholar in the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and a key architect of recent major agreements between environmental groups and corporations on the future of American hydropower and the siting of utility-scale solar energy. Dan's worked as an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, a deputy attorney general in Massachusetts, the founder of the nation's first investment firm focused exclusively on renewable energy. He's also served as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives at Google, and Executive Director of Stanford's Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. Dan was also a member of the first expedition to navigate the entire Rio Grande and to kayak the Yangtze River. The format for today's webinar is that we'll start with a few questions from me for all the panelists. At about 20 minutes before the hour, I'll turn the figurative microphone over to you and pose questions from all of you in the audience. To get a question into the queue, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can, and we'll provide written answers on the Woods website to questions we don't have time to address during the webinar. Phil, let me start with you. As somebody who has looked at permitting from the government perspective and from the private perspective, how do you design a project to make the permitting go as smoothly as possible?
I think there are things you certainly can control on the front end, reaching out to communities in advance and keeping them informed and talking to the political leadership about what you're trying to do. And I think most people who are doing this have gotten good at doing that. There are also a lot of things that are beyond that kind of control, under the general rubric of permitting, but basically all the kind of administrative things that have to go on to make these things happen, interacting with utilities and government at all levels. But I would just say that the number of projects which are ready to go, in the sense that they're contracted for, the money is there to do it, but are not going anywhere because of shortcomings in this whole process of getting through the paperwork, as it were, is tremendous. And I think there's probably nothing you could do to accelerate, green energy more than just cleaning up some of those soft problems now that things like the IRA in place to address some of the economics.
And Anna, that really sets things up for you, where you're kind of in the midst of reform around the National Environmental Policy Act. And can you tell us what's happening in the government and whether you see this as really opening up the space for the projects that Phil describes as on hold?
Well, thanks for the question, Chris. And there is a lot that the Biden-Harris administration is doing focused on permitting and accelerating the build out of this really critical infrastructure and to support clean energy and meet the president's climate and clean energy goals. There's a number of things we're doing, including the president's permitting action plan, which was his way of focusing the sort of whole of government approach on permitting, so that we have collaboration across agencies and the White House. And I can tell you, I came back to the government to focus on this because it is such an important thing. And it's not just me, there's a whole host of people focused on the problem and moving projects forward. We had a lot of benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act funding to support agency capacity on permitting and environmental reviews. There's nearly $1 billion that was in that agencies are already seeing the benefit from. In addition, we have from the Fiscal Responsibility Act amendments to NEPA that were focused on speeding things up, and we are implementing those as we speak. In addition, CEQ has proposed an update to our NEPA regulations, the bipartisan permitting reform implementation rule, and that is really focused on modernizing our regulations to accelerate environmental reviews, and has a big focus both on integrating aspects of climate change, environmental justice, and this really key piece on public engagement. So those, and the final piece too is we also really looking at our digital tools that are available now, and how those we may be able to bring those to bear on some of these issues in order to have, our holy grail is effective and efficient permitting at the federal level.
And the counterbalance of that is action that can be taken in the project development space and by the entities that are concerned about progress. And Dan, that's really the area where you've been working to push these major agreements. And how do you see progress in agreements between especially environmental groups, environmental justice groups, and project developers as complementing or accelerating the actions that are being taken in the federal government?
Well, thanks, Chris. It's great to be here. I think these agreements that we've been working on, and I'll mention the specifics in 1 second, are really a good way to push the system. We need changes inside government, at the federal level, at the state level, to improve siting, to improve permitting. But at the same time, I think we can kind of test things from the outside and take on some of the biggest siting and permitting challenges that we have and see if we can accelerate them. The three that we've been working on, first is what I think is the oldest environmental conflict in the United States, which is that between the dam builders and the river conservationists, going all the way back to John Muir and the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And a few years ago, we took that one on, we brought them to the table. And 2.5 years later, after a lot of negotiating, we reached a major agreement. Congress funded this agreement at almost $2.5 billion to begin to implement it. And we've made some real progress in both what we call the 3 R's: rehabilitate some of those dams for safety, retrofit some for power, and remove some of them for conservation. These are the 90,000 plus dams in the US. We got asked, with the success in that, to take a look at what maybe even a more near-term and difficult conflict, which is over siting big solar projects measured in the hundreds or thousands of acres, and land conservation and environmental groups. We launched that, and just last month in October, we reached a major agreement there that we think is going to help a lot in resolving some of these conflicts, that will both get large solar projects built at scale, but also address concerns that land conservationists, local communities, tribes, and others have. And then over the summer, we launched a third one, which grew out of the Solar Uncommon Dialogue, as it's called, which is maybe the trickiest one of all, which is how to site and build long-distance transmission lines, what we desperately need if we're going to build big solar projects, big wind projects all over the country. Siting transmission, permitting transmission is really, really difficult. We think we've got an approach to both the siting aspects to this, and also how you allocate costs and benefits to the folks along that line, the folks who built the solar project at the start, the folks who received the green electrons at the end. So all of these have really helped us think through what we can do overall for permitting in this country.
Phil, you spent much of your career trying to find ways to get people who come from different sides of the political spectrum to agree. And when you think about that experience in the context of permitting, how do you think about the opportunities in the kind of agreements that Dan has been describing, or in the kind of regulatory reform that Anna's been describing? And are there ways we can make those work together, or how do we move to politics?
I mean, I guess I found, I was Democratic governor in a very red state. There was always an opportunity for politics like that to intrude. But I think with a little bit of work, by not structuring questions and statements sort of in the context of, in ways that just invite people to take it as a point of difference or as a political point, you can get through that. I mean, certainly we found with what I'm doing now in solar that emphasizing, I mean, most of these plants are going in the southeast, at least in very rural and very Republican areas, but emphasizing the economic development aspects of it. There are counties we've gone into where you instantly become the biggest taxpayer in the county, and with what it can do for schools and county governments and those kinds of things, you can emphasize that. I mean, in Georgia, we've had the governor of Georgia, who is no friend of climate action, come out to all the openings because the emphasis is not about green electrons. The emphasis is about this is a way to help some of these poorer counties to establish the kind of tax base they need to do the things they want to do for their kids and their county. So I guess I'd say that, the permitting stuff, it's easy to make it into the enemy. It's, believe me, I'm not on the receiving end. Government's the problem here. They're not doing this stuff with permitting. I think a lot of times you can avoid that things by just the way you structure things and the things you choose to talk about. And also just to remember, which I hope we're going to talk about, that there's lots of obstacles to developing green energy besides the narrow sort of government permitting kinds of issues. And some of those, I think at this point, are even more important than the permitting.
Anna, the Biden-Harris administration is obviously putting a lot of emphasis on having the economics be favorable for projects, but it's also thinking a lot about environmental concerns and about environmental justice. Can you comment on how the administration sees the three pieces, the development piece, the environment piece, and the justice piece fitting together?
Sure. And I would also just add on to Phil's last answer too. For some of this, there's bipartisan support because the need is just clear. Whether that's keeping the lights on with the grid or feeling some of these more direct impacts from climate change that unfortunately we're all experiencing now on a more regular basis. But the Biden-Harris administration is really trying to integrate all three of those issues. We need to make, you've heard President Biden say over and over again, when he thinks about climate, he hears jobs. And so that job development, economic development is critical. But he also understands we have a lot of environmental justice communities that have not seen the benefits of past energy development, and now we have that opportunity to bring them along. And so environmental justice and incorporating that is really at the heart of the modernization of the NEPA rules that we are proposing. It's actually for the first time is directing agencies to consider environmental justice in their environmental reviews and incorporating other measures to avoid or reduce the disproportionate effects on communities, as well as including the cumulative effects of pollution. And one aspect of the proposal that I'm excited about and hopefully we'll see come to fruition is directing agencies to identify a chief public engagement officer so that there's a person tasked within agencies that really have this as front of their mind. We, for a long time, have had chief environmental officers or environmental review officers who wear the hat to make sure NEPA and other environmental reviews go along. And we really would like to see that reflected with a chief public engagement officer as well. So those are some of the things we're doing.
Could you just say one more word about how you think about adding additional protections and concerns for the environmental justice interests without adding complications, and is there a philosophy of streamlining that goes along with this?
I think that we have to really couple that with the engagement pieces that we're also looking at. And, really our goal here is for everyone involved, so the agencies, the project developer, and the communities to have the opportunity and the capacity to talk about these projects and be able to move them along quickly. There was a recent report by the Center for American Progress that looked at a number of case studies of these big infrastructure projects in clean energy that have been sort of completed successfully. And at the heart of that was engagement. So I know, every project is unique, every engagement has to be unique, but we know when we see successful projects get through the review, it's because that engagement piece has really been critical.
And you already spoke a little bit about the challenge of allocating benefits and costs for some of these projects, especially ones like transmission, where not entirely clear how people in the middle of the system receive benefits. As you think about the point that both Phil and Anna have made about the importance of having these projects be attractive for development for people all along the chain, how do you think we should rethink this issue of benefit and cost allocation?
Well, let me give you an example. I like to talk about the 700-mile transmission line that cuts across 3 states. As I said, you start at one end with a beautiful new solar project that Phil might have developed. You have folks at the other end receiving those green electrons, and in between, you've got people who don't receive a lot of benefit. They mostly look at this giant transmission line, except if they happen to own land right along the path of that line. And so it's one thing to, in a sense, permit the transmission line, make sure you've gone through the environmental impact statement and looked at endangered species. But that's only one piece of this. The other piece is, how do you make sure that when all is said and done, the benefits and the costs flow evenly, or at least I shouldn't say evenly, flow equitably to folks at the beginning, the end, and everybody in between? That actually is a tricky proposition. And it differs from state to state, region to region, how that's worked out. We have some of these regional transmission operators that have some formulas for how you might think about doing that. We have others who don't. But actually, that can be the bigger challenge in finally getting that 700-mile transmission line built. And that's why I'm hopeful that this uncommon dialogue, as we call it, on transmission, that brings all the key players to the table, including environmental justice representatives, including tribes, including the developers, investors, folks who oversee the permitting of this facility, get them to sit down and talk about whether there's some approaches that make it a little more predictable and a little more equitable as far as how you allocate these costs and benefits. Because if we can't do it, we might actually get some permits for these lines, but we might not actually get them built, because the war will be too intense over people who feel like they're getting screwed along the way, to put it in very direct terms.
Bill, you mentioned that we need to have a conversation that's broader than just permitting and talks about additional barriers and enablers to moving big projects forward. And this allocation of benefits and costs is one of those. What else do you think about when you're envisioning a new project?
Yeah, I would say, by the way, just as a quick comment about the question you just asked, when it comes to what's preventing the development of solar, and in the case that I understand best, in most parts of the country that we operate, it's not environmental. The cultural concerns are not environmental justice concerns. The cultural concerns are, we're farmers. We don't like the idea of taking 1,500 or 2,000 acres of farmland out of service. And finding, I mean, that's the objection that people offer. And it's, it's a legitimate lifestyle objection for people who built generations of lives around these things. Um, when you talk about other things, one thing I mentioned, for example, is if you had to list what are the problems with developing solar and making these pipelines today, the overwhelming issue is grid access. I mean, it's doing it's finding land, which is always tough to you got to do where it's accessible to the grid. But the big thing now is these interconnection studies. And there was a report out of Lawrence Berkeley here recently that there are 2,000 gigawatts of stuff in the pipe clogging up the pipeline of these. That's 1.5 times the total generating capacity of everything in the United States. I mean, clearly most of that stuff's never going to be built. And what you have is a system for doing these interconnections, such which you have to do, which is built around a world in which there were a few big fossil fuel plants built every year, and they took 8 or 10 years to build. And there's a regulatory system or a system built around that. That's not what green energy is. It's much more distributed, it's much faster. And things that could happen. And I said the federal government, I think, would have a role to play here and some leadership to straighten this system out so that it's modernized and responsive to what the real problems are. These softer issues are now the thing that's absolutely in the way of the speed of development of these things, and you're not addressing questions of justice or environmental justice or who benefits or anything else. You're just sort of trying to straighten out there's something that needs to be done administratively, and the systems that are doing it are not up to the task.
And would you characterize this as a situation where we actually have a okay system for designing the new transmission infrastructure for the way we did energy 30 years ago, and that it's not pernicious elements, it's just the march of time and progress that requires a different approach?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was speaking specifically of the interconnection studies, but certainly the whole issue with the grid. I mean, you have a grid designed around a few big plants distributing power out, radially out to all these users. That's not what the world looks like when you put a lot of green power, wind or solar onto the system. And of course, the grid is very patchwork anyway. I mean, it's utility by utility across the country, and it too is going to need to be modernized. But that's a very long-term and very expensive issue. Sorting out some of these issues of getting these studies done, I think is something that they you can do with a pencil if someone's willing to do it.
Yeah, Chris, if I could
And
just,
you want to comment on this interconnect issue? Yeah.
just to put a little more on that point, interconnection basically means you've built a big solar project and you do have a transmission line, or you have a transmission line that's pretty close. You've got to connect that project to the grid. And it's these thousands of interconnection requests do require a regulator to analyze them and say, yeah, we can do it effectively, we can do it safely, it's ready to go. But we're not processing those very quickly. And so that's really caused, some real indigestion in the system of building large scale solar projects all over the country. On top of that, some of those projects get built where they do need, big transmission lines to get these electrons to market. That's a different issue. They're both tough, but I think to Phil's point, the interconnection requests, just connecting the project to the grid is one we could work our way through. It's a massive backlog. We ought to be able to get these individual studies done. And ought to be able to get the interconnection decisions made and loosen things up.
These interconnection requests, there's something that done right, they can take 6 months to 12 months to do. I mean, there's some work involved. I mean, today, if we sign a contract with somebody to provide green electrons, it's 4 years before anything starts going onto the grid. One of those is construction, and 3 of them are permitting, and in the general sense, and overwhelmingly, it's the interconnection times. It's gone up from a year to there are places where it's now 7 years in the queue to be able to get these studies done. They have to be done.
And the interconnections are often at the scale of the states or the independent system operators, as I understand, and not really at the federal level. Anna, do you want to comment on whether there is a federal role in fixing this part of the system?
Well, I would just point to one of to FERC and a couple of the rules that they are working through, both on transmission, regional planning, and touching on interconnection too. I think they're an independent agency, so and they're the commissioners there are dedicated experts and working hard on all of those things. But I think those are going to be some of the key things moving forward, and their work there is going to be very, very important.
Let me swing back to this question of permitting for the interconnects. If the issues aren't environmental concerns and they're not environmental justice, is it really just that the system can't accommodate the way that the modern energy grid works?
Well, I think if you imagine, if someone wants to build a big utility scale thing, I'm talking, I don't know, 100 megawatts and up, these big projects. I mean, there will be 8 or 10 bidders on it, people who want to play. And typically these things require you to have an interconnection study. So there will be 10 interconnection studies filed. And what most of these utilities have done in the past is just sort of put them in a queue. It was first in, last, first in, first out. Yeah, so like, a queue, a queue that way. FERC has tried to address that issue by making people put down deposits. $250,000 deposit to do a study or something like it. But it's a deposit, and it might knock out a few small players, but all the big players, it's not an issue. Fine, they put the money in. If they don't get the project, they'll get it back. But something where having to showing that you have a project literally ready to go in the sense of contracted and financed and so on, moves you to the head of the queue, okay, or up to the front of the queue, would be the sort of thing that I would think FERC could do, and they certainly could jawbone it to the utilities, and would make a huge difference in terms of just sort of getting the good projects through all the noise and up to the top of the queue where they get serviced. And and I presume I'm certainly not an expert in electrical transmission, but I presume that there could be some ways of setting some standards that had to be put together, which would simplify a lot of the processing that has to be done. It's the sort of thing that I think if someone wanted to take responsibility for it and sat down in a room with the players, you could figure out how to shorten this process up. There's just nobody stepping into that breach right now.
Dan, are there states or regions that are doing a better job in this space?
Well, much of this is, at the level of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I think that we could make some improvements, and this is a problem we've got. Broadly speaking, we've got thousands and thousands of hydropower dams in this country that are coming up for renewal of their licenses to operate and generate electricity. There's a real backlog as far as those go at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We have scores of proposals for new, what's called pumped storage hydropower, a way to store electricity. Those have got to be processed through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And this is an agency, last I looked, that doesn't have a chairman in place, hasn't been approved by the Senate. So there's a lot of things stuck in Washington, D.C. that I think are more a matter of just putting larger numbers of personnel in place and getting things going at a faster rate. To Phil's point, there is a big difference. In the old days, we'd have to connect to the grid, call it, tens or scores of plants. Now we've got hundreds or thousands because we're building a more distributed electricity system in this country. So it's understandable that there is some constipation in the system, but I think some of this could be accelerated. And Anna, you wanted to add something?
Please go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I was gonna add, when I think about getting these projects built, there's sort of four things. There's the investment financial side of things, the permitting side of things, supply chain, which we haven't talked about, but also workforce. And that's both, the people to build it, but as a permitting evangelist now, I've been saying, permitting jobs are climate jobs too. So for the young people who may be tuning in, please think about that, because as Dan mentioned, the capacity of agencies to have the staff to do these reviews. And it takes a whole range. Sometimes it's archaeologists, sometimes it's a technical person who is an engineer, and there's a whole range of ways for people to engage that we really need, looking at both the federal and state level on these permitting reviews.
I think that'll be one takeaway from today's conversation, the concept of permitting jobs. Let me ask my last question before we turn it over to the audience, to you. And the administration is clearly committed to making good on its climate goals. But the stuff we're talking about today is really slowing things down. And how do you think about this interface between the ambitious goals and all of the barriers that we've been describing?
I think it kind of, one of the things that I found out when I got into political office, when I was, as you know, the mayor of Nashville before, and then the governor of our state, was that the real power of those jobs was not, say, do this, do that. It was the power to convene, that you actually had a lot less power in many of them than a comparable corporate executive, would have in terms of budgets and stuff. So this is one where I think, that the president, for example, should look at it and say, look, I put myself on the line, and one of the huge accomplishments of my administration so far has been the IRA, for example. There's all sorts of soft things in the way of actually spending that money. IRS hasn't issued regulations on things that it needs to do. There's stuff that's very unclear about these energy communities. There's the whole interconnection issue. To call some of these people together and say, look, we've done the first part of it. We've put money on the line, an enormous amount of money on the line in terms of these tax credits. And I need you guys to step up now and get rid of some of these soft barriers. And that's something that really only a governor or a president or someone like that can do. But it's going to take that kind of central, I think, saying this is just as important to me as a tax credit or an appropriation.
Terrific. Let me turn now to questions from the audience. There are a whole bunch. There are 22 questions, and we're certainly not going to get to all of them. But a number of questions speak to themes that I would really love to see us get at. And I want to start with one for Anna. This one is from Anna Koster. Can you explain what makes effective engagement? And do you have any examples of good engagement and less effective engagement?
Well, it is a tricky, well, not tricky, but I mean, every project is unique. And that is, in one of the reasons in our update, we have some additional directions to agencies about, making sure to engage with the community in the languages that they speak, and better, are providing information in a way that they can grapple with. But that is actually a place that we're trying to learn, and as part of our public comment period, which closed about a month ago, that I was really asking folks like Phil, who are out there doing project developers, Dan, working through the uncommon dialogue to better understand what is working and what is effective there. And CEQ really wants to then work with our agencies to make sure that that gets translated into their work as well. But, you know, it is just, there's no easy answer really on how to speed all these things up, because it does, you know, you have to engage with the communities and try and move to having them support projects, so that there is then certainty both for the community, the project developer, and the agencies as we move forward on this infrastructure build out.
So maybe you could comment on this one as well, but I want you to do it in the context of another question that came in. This one's from Cheryl Clark. She says, what kinds of benefits do sustainable power projects, wind, solar, geothermal, et cetera, bring to areas where they're sited other than the tax benefits? And how do you sell these types of installations to rural or conservative areas?
I think there are probably two things that are primary. One of them is well, three, including the tax benefit. I mean, it does have tax benefits. It provides in some of these poor rural counties significant tax revenue. Second of all, especially during the construction, it's a lot of good jobs. I mean, a large project might employ 600 to 1,000 people, many of which can be hired locally. They're not long term; they're a year and a half jobs, but they're important to these communities. And then third of all, one of the biggest demands for green electricity outside of a single point of a data center or something are from political jurisdictions that want to recruit business. And so many businesses that are now looking for places to recruit consider having access to green energy as one of the conditions they have to have. As is not something you can start to do because the time scale is so long. So having these things available is a great assistance in being able to recruit manufacturing facilities, for example, that people want because they want that green energy. So it does those things. I thought Anna was right on point with that. I mean, everyone is different, and I think what you have to do is look at a community and say, what are the issues here? I mean, there may or may not be an indigenous community that cares about what's going on. There may or may not be environmental concerns about the site, question. And it's not something the corporate world has been particularly good at. I mean, it's not the way usually you do business with that kind of need for the more political outreach. And I think helping to have people understand that these are a little different than plopping down a manufacturing facility somewhere, because just for sheer size of them, nothing else. And that there's another piece to the whole thing, which is just as important as the engineering and so on, of bringing along these different groups.
Hey,
Yeah.
Chris, could I add one point?
Please.
So there's another benefit that you can structure, and this was really made a difference in our uncommon dialogue on large-scale solar development and land conservation. Imagine 1,000-acre solar development, the sort that Phil has worked on. Some cases, if you could, and this is happening in some cases, if you can figure out how to protect, conserve another 1,000 acres, maybe reforest it, improve its ability to capture carbon, you can bring the conservation community, the environmental community along. And this was a big breakthrough for us in the negotiation over the solar uncommon dialogue, because we had land conservation groups who were sort of reluctant about, what we were up to, how to create a path for much larger solar development. But when they realized there was a point of leverage there to also conserve land at the same time, to also improve carbon uptake by reforesting land, there's a win-win there. So there's a lot that can really benefit a region, a community, if you do solar development right.
Any solar project, any plot of land is going to have areas that are not developed. I mean, they're wetlands, for example, and so on. And just reaching out and saying to conservation is, look, why don't we plant, I'm making this up as I go here, but why don't we plant milkweed here? Everyone is looking for ways to better support
Monarch butterflies. Yeah.
In this particular case, monarch butterflies, but I mean, there are things like that you can do that go a long way toward making people feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And it seems like the real bottom line is to start the engagement process early, recognize that it's a key element of what you need to do to bring a project to completion. And let me ask a technical question. This one came from someone who didn't put in their name. What's the opportunity around building smaller, localized or regionalized microgrids that don't require massive transmission infrastructure? And might they be able to build more quickly and provide more resilience? Is there a space for smaller scale infrastructure to avoid these issues, or do they ultimately run into the same kinds of things? Dan, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, it's a good question, and this is regularly comes up. You know, why do we need to build 500-acre, 1,000-acre, 5,000-acre solar projects? Why can't we build, you know, put it on rooftops, do urban projects? And the challenge you find is the amount of land that we've got to develop in the United States. Call it 10 million acres, call it the size of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined, and that's at the modest end, to really realize the climate benefits of large scale solar, really pushes you towards a lot of big time, large acreage development. You can get to maybe 10 or 15 or 20% of what we've got to do from a climate perspective with smaller projects. But ultimately, we've got to build a lot of big projects. Big projects get you out further into rural land, get you further away often from existing transmission. And so that's what triggers all of this. Yes, to smaller distributed solar energy projects, electricity storage projects, we should do all of that, but we've got to, at the same time, do large scale development if we're going to get to the big numbers of gigawatts that we've got to develop to really address the climate crisis.
Anna, do you want to comment on the government's approach to this?
Well, I would say, I mean, just to Dan's last point there, we are going to need all of it. And so in that regard, you know, the Biden-Harris administration is looking at how we can get some of these bigger projects built and the transmission to bring them to where they're needed, the loads where it's needed, as well as what we can do on the more distributed side of things, which is incredibly important also for the resilience piece and other, you know, emergency type of function. There's also just a lot of opportunity sitting there, and the DOE Loan Program Office under Jigar Shah is really looking at how to put together some virtual power plants, as they call them, to really bring together efficiency, batteries from electric vehicles, or, you know, household level storage, and smaller scale renewables to address those needs. So it's, I mean, kind of like the climate crisis, we need to do everything we can. And so, you know, I'm glad there's just smart, dedicated folks working across the government and also out in the project development space, bringing their innovative ideas to bear.
Bill, I think I cut you off. My apologies.
Oh, no, I was not. But just to underline what Dan said, I mean, if you've got some customer who needs 200 megawatts of solar, yes, it is a pain in the neck in a lot of ways to permit a 200 megawatt solar farm, but they're trivial compared to trying to do 45 megawatt solar farms. It's much less expensive to do it in larger quantities like that. The legal work expands beyond comprehension when you do those small ones. I think anytime there's an opportunity to do a 5 megawatt, we ought to do it. But that's not where you get to the scale that we need to really make a difference on the climate action.
Dan, here's a question from Ryan Bartlett. He says, how many of the solutions we need to speed up the approval and overall development of renewable energy projects are already at our fingertips, and what can we only achieve through new legislation or regulatory reform?
Great question. There's lots of things, you know, and I think Phil raised this issue of interconnection, that we don't need new legislation. We just need to get more people on it, move the schedules more quickly. So there's a lot that can be done without major federal legislation. There's a lot of state authority to get things done, and there's a lot of innovation among the states in getting more things built that we need. So, you know, if you're citing a transmission line and it doesn't cross, you know, the boundaries of two states, the federal government has less authority over it. Not to say none, but, and if you've got a state that's, you know, wants to see renewables develop for economic reasons, knows that transmission has got to get built, you may have a better situation there. Again, there will be some federal jurisdiction there. There'll be certain things that have to be looked at, but it may be a simpler way to do this. There's examples in New York State, for example, bringing power down from Canada right into New York City. And there's a project going on there that I think has real shot at being developed, hundreds of miles of transmission just through the state of New York, coming from north of the border in Canada. And I think that's gonna probably get built. So there's a lot we can do without having to pass new laws in Congress. If, and here's the risk, if we can put enough people on this from a permitting standpoint. And one of the things that does keep me up at night is that if we have a change in administration come 2024, and we've got folks who come into power who would really like to dismantle some of these agencies or cut back their staffing, I think this problem could actually get worse and not better.
So you've already spoken a lot about building support for projects that are, with the support being nonpartisan and based on economics rather than environmental perspectives. Do you think that's the way to deal with the political risk of whatever might happen in 2024?
Yeah, we've been able to do things without getting so involved with politics. I mean, first of all, you try to avoid the federal government whenever possible. I mean, just as a general principle.
You can plug your ears for that.
But I mean, the reality is that things are, there's a lot of things that are difficult in that regard. But the demand from industry, from big companies that, these big data center companies, Facebook and Amazon and Google, and as you know, they want this stuff and they're willing to contract for it. And there's a lot of ways in which they can do it, which doesn't involve in any way, regulatory authorities in Washington or, whatever. So I think it could be there. And I think there's a lot of examples in what Dan described. And Anna and I have talked about this issue of there's big incentives for using domestic content. And so a great idea, a very valuable kind of thing. Legislation has been passed. It's now 15 months since it was out. There are no regulations out of the IRS about how you count the domestic content. No lender is going to put money and no law firms are going to issue opinions without having IRS guidance on how this stuff is going to be counted. And that's just a matter of somebody putting that at the head of the queue and getting it, and getting it done.
So let me
add
just ask
two things there.
Go ahead,
Chris,
sure. Go ahead. And then I'm going to swing back.
Okay.
I'm going to swing back to for a
just,
closing comment from each of you, just a heads up.
Okay. Yeah, the good news is we passed historic clean energy and climate legislation, and the bad news is we passed historic clean energy and climate legislation, and that burden is falling, on the executive branch as they are trying to deal with all the number of programs to stand up and start flowing and give the guidance as Phil has noted. And there are lots of people focused on doing their utmost to get those out just as soon as we can. The other thing I would also just flag that we're trying to learn from is also on the digital side of things. There are a lot of new tools to make applications engagement more effective and efficient. And so we're trying to move the executive branch forward and federal agencies on that, and learning a lot from the success that states have already had in this area too. So that's one other area that I think we can see some progress soon, and we're trying to bring it about.
Thank you. It's been a fabulous conversation. Let me turn to each of you for a closing thought. Dan?
Yeah, permitting is part of the broader opportunity we've got to site, finance, build, operate all these really important clean energy facilities across the country. We've got an amazing moment right now with so much money available as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Thank you, President Biden, for pushing those so hard. So the opportunity is big, and I think we've seized it somewhat. I think we can seize it even more if we can take some of the steps we've talked about today. I remain very optimistic what we can do to really put clean energy at a scale that's really going to both do important things to address the climate crisis and do good things economically for regions all over the country. So I want to thank you, and I remain an optimist on this whole area.
Thank you. Anna, closing thought.
Sure. Well, today the latest national climate assessment came out, which just further underscores the urgency of action on climate. And I think, as you've heard today, we need everyone who cares about that and deploying clean energy to really get involved. So, I just, in addition to thinking about policy and other things that may need to change, I just would encourage people to get involved where they are to help move these clean energy projects in particular forward in your communities and states.
There's an old saw that's been going around for probably hundreds of years that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you make every problem into a nail. And I think the Congress is kind of guilty of that, in that the tool they have is appropriating money, not getting into the details. So they make every problem into appropriating money. And when that's done, sort of everybody says, okay, that's done, on to the next problem. But but in a lot of ways, it's half of the problem. I mean, getting the money there is a piece of it. But getting all this soft stuff done that prevents you from spending that money or makes it inefficiently used and so on is in a lot of ways just as important. And that's the thing right now that needs attention. We need to move these things forward. I mean, this is an existential kind of crisis, and we shouldn't let, just the inability to do stuff that isn't even particularly expensive to grease the wheels, as it were, of this process is really, really important. The most important thing right now.
Thank you so much to Governor Phil Bredesen, Dan Riker, and Anna Unruh-Cohen for a conversation that really shined a bright and useful spotlight on a series of problems that, as all of you have said, we're making progress in solving, and we can make more progress in solving, really opening up the potential for the energy transition that needs to come. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thanks also to the Superbs Woods Institute staff, Lee Rosenbaum, Kamaya Daniels, Molly Field, Roberta Tugendreich, Celia Daniels, and Chris Black. And also thanks to Justin Warren and Evan Schwartz for Zoom support. Thanks to everyone in the audience who joined us today. Farewell.